thing to say is what a week it has been. No doubt about that. We've had oil prices soaring above $105 on Brent in the aftermath of the beginning of the invasion, and then very quickly retreating down to well below 100 on the news ultimately that energy would not be sanctioned. We did a poll last week that was just showing on the screen there that whether people thought energy would end up being sucked into this crisis. And we had, as you can see, very likely, and definitely being, together, 87% of those in this room. So that's where, and of course, the news since that poll was taken at the end of last week, we've had all of the news not only about SWIFT now on the table, but even Germany seems to be growing some huevos and getting involved. Is it too late? Who knows? But this is, in some ways, feels like the beginning of a long slog. And I'm going to bring in Adi Imsirovic, Senior Research Fellow, the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, who himself, a Bosnian, had to survive something that probably is not too dissimilar. Your thoughts, Adi, this morning, what this crisis in Ukraine means ultimately, where it goes, and ultimately what it means for the world of commodities.
Thank you, Sean. Good morning. Well, first of all, my thoughts are with the people of Ukraine at the moment, undergoing horrendous onslaught by a major superpower. The parallels are uncanny with the wars in former Yugoslavia, as I early on chatted with Christoph about. It's that when you have a major power, it's quite easy to roll the troops across the countryside and the villages, but once you come to the cities is when the real fighting starts, and a determined defense will put up a very, very stiff resistance. Unfortunately, in the cities, once they're besieged, you are very, very likely to see some horrendous sort of deaths and destruction. So I hope it doesn't happen, but everything is just pointing that way. In terms of what it means for the whole world and the eventually energy market, well, the whole world is just this. This is just something probably the worst case scenario we've seen. It seems to me obvious that Putin is intent on taking Ukraine, and only then probably sitting at some kind of negotiating table with Putin. But I think he's probably proving quite wrong, because resistance from Ukraine is quite stiff. In terms of the world, I think the world is waking up to it. I think we kind of sleepwalked into this whole thing. We saw the reaction of Germany, the country that only weeks ago was just sending helmets to the Ukrainians, now suddenly decided to send Sting missiles and anti-armor weaponry and so on. Once that happens, I think it's a very, very serious escalation of the whole conflict. Once sort of British and German weapons are being used against the sort of Russian troops, I think we're getting close to a very, very complicated situation. In terms of the oil market, I think the market is in denial. Yes, the initial sanctions were very light, and that's why the market dropped on Friday. But there's absolutely no way that the West can make even a dent in sort of Russians' willingness to negotiate anything, unless that eventually involves energy, which is whatever, almost 40%, half of the Russian budget, and a big chunk of their exports. So I think unfortunately I can see situations getting worse and more difficult. I would not be surprised if we see a loss of some of the Russian supplies. Already we're seeing people avoiding loading Russian crude. That's why we've seen the deepest discounts I think I've ever seen for Russian crude. Before, other than contamination case that we saw in 2019, I think Russian crude in Northwest Europe is trading about $11 below dated Brent. Ship owners are avoiding Russian ports freight rates and insurance premiums are going through the roof. So I think we're already seeing some of those beginnings.
Christoph Ruhl, good morning and welcome. Thank you for coming back to the table. Senior Research Scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy, Columbia University. Essentially the same question to you, Christoph, with the added caveat that we sleepwalked into this. This is the piece that I think is quite shocking. Mohamed El-Erian, as you may be familiar with, obviously well-known economist and commentator, described it as such. This was a surprise. This was a shock, and that he yet at the same token describes it as a major geopolitical fracture not seen since the Second World War. It's going to change the world. And he's a sober enough guy. So I'm wondering, A, how did the brains of the markets of the world miss this as a I'm surprised, and B, is it this significant? Your thoughts?
You should give yourself some credit, and good morning, first of all, because at least on your show, at least on several Sundays before everybody really took this on the agenda, it was mentioned that this is brewing and that this is going to be very nasty. And so it happened. So we discussed this several times. I was not surprised by the crisis. I was surprised by the ferocity of the Russian attack, the all-out attack. But the basic picture that Russia does not want a thriving, prosperous, democratic Ukraine that would be a thorn in its side and wants to take back, the old Humpty Dumpty to some extent. That has been coming for a long time. The markets are sometimes slow to react. This happens, it happened also during the Iraq War, happened during the invasion of Afghanistan and in other events. So the question is, where do we go? On the military side, I won't speculate. Seems to be that Ukraine is slowing down Russia, and obviously the longer it takes, the more a stalemate becomes sort of what usually happens in these situations. The country split and then nobody talking to each other, and the situation dragging on perhaps for decades. The more it frustrates Russian efforts. There's another parallel to Yugoslavia, which I would think is probably coming, but we have to be very hopeful that it would. That is when an invading army, ethnically motivated and aggressive, becomes frustrated. The next thing usually happening is massacres. That's something. And there are some people in the Russian section of Lugansk and the Donetsk which are capable of doing this. And that's, of course, what we saw in the Yugoslav war, and then what led to the NATO bombardment of Belgrade. And so something like that could be the opposite pole of a stalemate and a ceasefire. But I want to point out something which we already know, and again, it is not discussed enough, and markets should take note, which is something really big has happened, and it's not SWIFT. What has happened to the sanction system is the kicking out of some Russian banks of the SWIFT system. And what has happened is the freezing of Russian central bank assets. And that is really a game changer, I think. So let me remind you, just it's worthwhile thinking about this for a minute. What Adi has said is true. So already now with sanctions against individual banks and nobody knowing what's guaranteed from Russia or not, trade is in turmoil, crude oil exports and gas exports will be affected. But these are all things which increase the transaction costs eventually. Eventually, money will find channels, brokers, houses will be set up. The trade will continue because the direct trade for energy has not been sanctioned. And in that sense, markets were rational to react very little with the oil price. If you add SWIFT exclusion to that packet, it doesn't change much. It makes the transaction costs higher. But SWIFT is a messaging system. Brokerage houses will be set up, ways will be found around it. There's rudimentary messaging systems in Russia, in China, which could grow. And again, as long as energy trade has not been tackled directly, it will probably have a price impact, will create turmoil and spikes in prices for a few weeks, but then it settles into a new normal. What has happened now is something very different. When you think of a central bank in an extreme crisis situation, it has to have two basic functions. Number one, it has to prevent the currency from being sort of untradeable in order for whatever is allowed by sanctions to continue. So it has to continue to keep the ruble convertible. And number two, it has to create monetary stability at home, prevent hyperinflation and all that. How do central banks do that? They have amassed foreign currency reserves. And we have spoken oftentimes about the fortress Russia, 640 billion currency reserves plus gold reserves. Where is that held? usually the big chunk or all of it is held with the Federal Reserve in New York. It says it's in dollars, right? And in euros, it's held somewhere in Brussels, presumably, or in Frankfurt. So an unknown but large chunk of these 640 billion are actually held with banks abroad. And now the sanctioning of the central bank in Russia involves two steps. Number one, it will make it impossible or illegal for Western institutions to buy rubles. So in order to strengthen the central bank, they would have to sell their dollars and buy rubles, driving up the rubles. If they can't do that anymore, then there's a real risk that the ruble goes into free fall. Number two, it will directly impair the central bank to use any of this currency reserves for buying anything as basic as bread or whatever they want to buy, or for monetary stabilization, because they've raised them. This has happened before only with North Korea, which didn't have much reserves anyway, Venezuela, same here, and Iran temporarily. It has never happened to a G20 country, never happened to a country with that kind of size of reserves. Now I still have to find out, haven't done that yet, how much of these reserves can actually be frozen, because they're not in gold and not in Moscow, but I suspect almost all of it. And that will turn Russia sort of in a financial pariah, really, because they can't pay their debt back, they will not pay dividends anymore, so they will be really sort of cut off in terms of their assets and their ability to service debt. And number two, that will immediately affect their capacity to deal with energy.
Adi, on the energy point, obviously, we're sort of focused on that, although it seems secondary on times like this, but nonetheless trying to create some insight where it intersects this crisis with the global energy picture, which of course affects so many other things thereafter as the dominoes fall. This week we have an OPEC plus meeting. Of course, Russia and all of the major Gulf Arab states are party to that. What do they do? I mean, my principal question is, it has the role or the purpose that OPEC Plus was created in the first place, and certainly this agreement, it's run its course at this stage, has it not? You're on mute, Adi, sorry.
Apologies.
It must be that coffee cup you're drinking out of. It's got other things in it, is it?
Absolutely, absolutely, from last night.
The Guinness cup. Guinness coffee. Good idea, actually.
Well, the role of OPEC and OPEC Plus is short-term revenue maximization. As simple as that. All these talks about sort of stabilizing the market, sort of just to sort of put veneer on the whole organization. The point is that they do want high oil prices, and they want them now. As a result, I don't expect OPEC Plus to do anything else, particularly because the whole organization is very fragile right now because simply of the Russian involvement. And we've seen that in the UN last night, abstentions and so on. So I wouldn't expect anything from OPEC Plus. But what I think I would like to come back to is the idea that Christoph and I started about sleepwalking to this situation, is that eventually Russian exports are going to be highly affected. And Sean, not if people think that it's going to be Europe and it's about Europe, I think they're totally wrong. Russia exports a lot of diesel, okay, most of it goes to Europe, but also exports a lot of fuel oil. Up to 500,000 barrels of oil in total is going to the United States, believe it or not. A lot of gasoline components cover the markets anywhere from US Gulf to Brazil, and it will affect those markets as well. So the flows of diesel, if there's a shortage of diesel in Europe, I think that's going to affect the ARB from the Asian markets. So the whole world is going to be affected by this in currently tight market. And this is one of the tightest markets I've seen in the last decade, even before the invasion of Ukraine. We are talking about M1 and M12, sort of 12-month spread on the Brent, about close to $15 a barrel. That's absolutely massive. I think even a loss of 1 million barrels or 2 million barrels will result in much higher oil prices. So quite frankly, as an ex-trader, I'm very surprised that the market is trading at these levels and not at $110, $120 a barrel at the moment.
I mean, would this be, given the, as you said, the purpose of OPEC Plus to maximize revenue, of course, but also to keep or manage a somewhat stable market? Is this a market screaming for some more stability, i.e. some more supply, or we're not there yet?
Well, I think it's very difficult on the current situation of this conflict to say. I mean, certainly the market could do with more supplies. There's always enough oil at a price, Sean. So, there is enough oil out there, but certainly at very, very high prices, and the sort of backwardation in the market and the premiums in the market very well reflect that shortage of oil at the right price. But having said that, if you look at the cracks, for example, gasoline cracks are just fantastic. Again, gasoline is leading this market recovery. We're talking about close to $20 a barrel cracks in April, May, and this is talking about EBOB, not even RBOB in the US. So distillates are looking very tight as well. So the market could certainly do with more oil, absolutely. And I think if OPEC really wanted to help the world economy in the long run, I think they should certainly be supplying more oil, but I very much doubt that.
Christoph, I mean, that's the point as well, in a way, and coming back to the question of what gets sucked into this vortex, right? We're coming into the start of a tightening cycle on the monetary side. The Fed are due to meet in weeks, the OPEC this week, but the Fed itself meeting in 2 weeks or so in terms of the expectation to start a tightening cycle. Politicians in the West, Biden is down, his ratings, polling is at record lows never seen by a president before. How do these things react, or how do they get changed by the impact the crisis has on the world?
Let me just say one thing first on the energy and oil markets and OPEC Plus. So I agree it's a revenue maximizing organization, but I disagree it's short term. Short term is usually defined less than a year. OPEC clearly has shown, OPEC Plus, that they have the long term in mind. In that sense, they want some stability in high prices too. Now the world knows, and one of the reasons markets were sluggish to react, that there is enough oil. And it's highly concentrated, and as we all know, where the spare capacity sits. So there's enough, but highly concentrated. So they really have it in their hands now. And on that basis, will be very reluctant to let prices fall. So they will try to support them. So for the time being, while these adjustments taking place, there will be some people getting very, very, very rich. As oil is exported, guarantee letters are missing, difficult to red ships. So this will be the trading houses. And then it will settle into something that some new normal, as people say. But what you can also see on the horizon is a big bunching of factors bringing prices down. Once this has been established, the world will not run out of oil. But then you have this massive movement now coming up, the drilling rates in the US, production from outside OPEC Plus, probably less demand from some places in the world, oil being redirected to China and all that you can just see in the second half or in the fall or so, forces accumulating, which would bring pressure on prices and make for quite a rapid adjustment. So,
I mean, on that point, just to pick up on that, I mean, obviously, if we take the global GDP downgrade that we got last month from the IMF and others, the idea that this could this accelerate a further downgrade of global economic growth, and actually we might be facing an oil price decline because this event triggers so many dominoes that economic growth globally gets hit?
It's possible. It's not a given because Russia's economy is smaller than Italy. And it's a huge commodity exporter, obviously. But so as per se, if it would be just a normal war, quotation marks, probably not. And wars are usually good for business, so it could lead to an increase in GDP. If you have a war or a car accident, GDP goes up. People should keep in mind, it's not down. But in this particular case, we are sort of in a deglobalization period. We have all sorts of bottlenecks. We have China sort of trying to walk a tightrope in the middle. If this leads to bottlenecks in commodity exports, to high grain prices for affecting poor countries, to high precious metal countries affecting the reorganization of the energy sector in many countries, to high energy prices affecting growth and inflation forecasts, yes, absolutely. The mixture is so combustible and so uncertain that I would think the chances of this having an impact through inflation or directly on global economic growth are higher than not having an impact, and that would be a negative impact.
Let's hit the survey question, which touches on the point I was asking with OPEC. Does the reasons for the creation of the current OPEC Plus agreement still exist? This is a 2-year thing. It's due to expire anyway in September. I think it's September at some point when everybody has maxed out their quotas. But the question is, has that already happened? The reason for the creation of current OPEC Plus agreement still exists, yes or no? I want to get some thoughts, Adi and Christoph, about obviously crystal ball. This is the week in review, but also the week ahead. Where does this go when the markets open tomorrow? Does the full velocity of this sort of sober moment come to dawn? What are your thoughts the week ahead? Adi, yeah.
Well, I think Christoph mentioned a very good point about the central bank, about SWIFT. Even though SWIFT excludes the energy companies, I also mentioned the other issues with shipping, insurance, freight, and so on. I think certainly it's definitely not bearish. This is definitely very, very bullish. If I was in the market, I wouldn't be short. I would definitely be long in this market. I think, if anything, the situation is going to be more and more complicated, given that the West has very limited sort of military involvement in this conflict, primarily through some weaponry that's been supplied. If the conflict gets prolonged, and if we see more, hopefully not as Christoph or possibly predicted, the sort of massacres, and I hope it doesn't turn out into anything like former Yugoslavia, but if it does get prolonged, there'll be more casualties. I think it's going to be very, very hard for the West to continue business as usual, buying gas and oil and products from Russia and just pretend everything is fine. And I think the situation is just going to get far more complicated. And I think this is unfortunately just the beginning of a very difficult and very complicated period in relations with Russia, as long as Putin is in power. So I would certainly be bullish this market, and by a long way, by a mile.
Christoph, the German government seems to have woken up this weekend, and it sort of slightly shifted sort of on their axis to getting much more involved. You mentioned earlier the weapon provision, but also overnight we had fairly strong words from the German foreign minister putting a big weight on the obligation of China when it comes to this Ukraine crisis and their obligations there, obviously the relationship with Russia, but also they have an independent relationship with Ukraine, import a lot of grain from Ukraine to China. Where do you think China fits into this puzzle now going forward, and your thoughts for the week ahead?
Yeah, the Germans, they're some pretty binary people. So they have switched. That's significant. On China, I think this is it's an interesting and a difficult question. They like, obviously, to sit on the fence and see where the chips fall. They are profiteers insofar as oil exports from Russia, at least, will have to be rerouted east. For gas, that's much more difficult. But also other commodities like coal can be rerouted, and they would be immediate beneficiaries from that. They seem to have been warned in advance, because contrary to what we've heard from some traders here, the big backwardation in the market seems to have coincided with China stocking up on crude oil right after Putin visited them. So starting there. And at the same time, so there's two other developments. One is this of competition with the US, which they would rather like to avoid. It's more the US that is trying to curtail trade and make life difficult for China. But most significantly, we have the Communist Party Congress coming up in October, November. The date is still secret. That tells you something, no? The date is secret. But at which President Xi wants to be the first president since Mao who exceeds 2 periods in office. And that's clearly how he sees himself, as the successor of Mao, just like Putin is the successor of Peter the Great and Stalin. So, and he will try to avoid things which rock the boat, but he will, if in doubt, I think, be pushed more towards Russia than towards the US. And the real tragedy, of course, is that when you talk to Russians, even those in government and educated, and just the overwhelming majority of people there, they see themselves more, like Europeans, and they want to negotiate and do trade and do business with Europe and the US, and they want to be in Paris and London and Brussels and in Washington and Chicago and Los Angeles, not in Beijing and Shanghai, but they are, and Riyadh for that matter, but they are sort of drifting that way under their current leadership. Ultimately, this becomes then a question whether the current Russian leadership is capable of steering the ship through all these difficult currents. And right now, this may seem like a very distant prospect, but it cannot be excluded that Putin has hurt enough people in Russia that at some point there will be an internal reaction trying to pacify the situation.
Adi, I would welcome your thoughts on the situation in the Black Sea and the Bosphorus and how important that is. I was reading some reports over the weekend that ships have been attacked there. Obviously Crimea is there, and it's what the Russians took first because of their naval fleet. But how important is the Black Sea vis-a-vis the movement of crude and other commodities?
Well, it's extremely important. Basically, most, let's say roughly about 2/3 of all Russian exports are sort of seaborne, and most of it comes out from Ust-Luga and Primorsk, but Novorossiysk is extremely important as well, particularly for any sales in the Mediterranean basin and as well as Asia and India. As we know, India recently bought about 4 million barrels of Russian crude. It's obviously,
hence why they perhaps abstained in the Security Council vote over the weekend.
Absolutely. But India is a bottom feeder, always been there in terms of crude oil buying, and they will, if it's cheap enough, they'll buy. They don't particularly care. At minus $10, $11 a barrel, they'll certainly look at that.
Yeah.
Especially given their recent sort of pickup in demand. So in terms of Black Sea, it's a complicated situation. Again, I certainly hope it doesn't get much more complicated, because Turkey clearly have put their weight behind sort of Ukraine rather than Russia, which makes it very interesting. Let's not forget that Turkey is outside the United States the most powerful NATO country in terms of the size of the army. So certainly that would complicate things a lot. There was even talk of blocking the Bosphorus Straits and so on and so forth. I think if that were to happen, we'd certainly very quickly lose about 1.5 million barrels of crude and products, primarily crude oil, which again, I'm just saying that this situation is so fluid and so complex at the moment that it certainly, I would not be caught short in this situation, because I don't see much particularly quick resolution to this. Looking at where Putin is, he is totally committed to this. I would also agree with Christoph that probably one of the easiest way out would be to see the end of Putin. And I think the way this situation is developing, I think the West will very soon realize that sort of ending Putin's reign is probably the only way to bring some stability back to Europe.
I mean, how do you live with this kind of politics for another 20 years, having, it stepped into a new zone? Christoph, let's just get the survey result and give you the last word. Survey, does the reason for creation of current OPEC agreement still exist? Yes, 2-1. Christoph, I wanted just to get your closing comments on how much the West gets sucked into this, in the willingness to score the own goal, to burden the pain. The first comments out of Biden the other night was, I don't want gasoline prices to go up on my citizens because they'll be upset and obviously they won't vote for me. It doesn't look like they're going to vote for him anyway. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, how much pain do you think the West are willing to take, will have to take, if they want to deal with this?
There is an interesting little factoid, which I haven't been able to disprove, even though I tried, which is that there never was a war between two democracies. So it tells you also something about the reaction towards the aggression, which historically has always been very slow. But at some point, when they decided to stand up to this, you could just look at the history of the Second World War. So then it can be quite successful and firm. So I think this is now an almost binary situation. Either it will slip into a stalemate pretty soon with some parts of the Ukraine occupied and the rest, and then you have sanctions and bickering and dialogue and nothing happening for 20 years. That would in a way be a bad situation, because it wouldn't change the root cause of it, which sits in this Russian behavior. Or it can get easily out of hand and will remain complicated, as Adi has said. Adi mentioned something very important in this region, which is Turkey. Turkey has supported Azerbaijan before in the war against. They have supported taken sides in Syria. They have sold a lot of their drones to Ukraine, and they can close the Black Sea. So even if Russia succeeds in getting all these harbors, which drives them to a considerable extent to the push in the south to get control of the Ukrainian ports, that's not the end of it. If Turkey by itself or under pressure from other Western countries closes the Bosporus, then Russian exports are even more hampered. I would think that in terms of what markets are, the other question, what markets are concerned, markets, as we all know, they hate insecurity, they hate volatility. So the more things become clear, even if the sanctions are very heavy, the more they will diverge. There will be normal developments somewhere in the US and to some extent in Europe, and the Russian market will be just frozen over for the time being. And debt service capacity in Russia and the Ukraine will go towards zero, and that will hurt some people in the West, but it's not a critical mass. There's not enough investment in Ukraine and Russia to really cause the course of sanctions to change. So the only thing which would cause that would be a cut into energy exports. And I don't see this happening when you think it through now. With the limited ability of the central bank to do anything, Russia becomes more or less dependent on currency receipts from energy and commodity sales. So they will try to push it on the market. The market will find ways of getting the oil and the commodities out and getting the money back. And this will increase prices and transaction costs in a first step. But then, it will be a little bit like Iran today. There's a constant source of inflows into the market, which analysts try to wrestle to have on their radar. And overall, sometimes brings prices down, sometimes brings them up. But since we don't have a fundamental shortage in oil, I think that will be controllable. More interesting or more dangerous, the shortage in grain coming up and the shortage in other precious commodities, metals and other things which we all need for semiconductors, for all the rest of it. And at the end of the day, Russia under these sanctions, unable to even use its airline to fly anywhere. So it will just be terrible for it will become reduced. Longer this continues, will be reduced to a commodity exporting pariah with no fun to live in. That's the sad.
Well, there we'll wrap it up this Sunday. We could review week ahead outlook, and this podcast, I suspect, will travel far and wide because you made some really insightful comments this morning. And I know it's bright and early in London, where both of you are sitting, and spring is only around the corner. Spring is only around the corner. Next time, it'll be 7:30, not a crazy 6:30. But I think it'd be interesting to see this week if we see the same volatility in the oil markets. When one would perhaps expect each day will bring a different kind of statement that we thought $10 up, $10 down last week. Will we see the same this week? I think a lot of that will depend on whether the West signal that they're willing to take some pain economically to contest this situation. We'll have to see. Christoph, thank you so very much. Have a great week. Adi as well. Have a great week. We'll catch up with you every day here at 10:30 UAE time. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.